Welcome everyone to this talk on Zionist hate mail as race gender ideology. I'm Amaya Gelman from the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. It is so good to be gathered with everybody, and it's a pretty big crowd, and I expect that it will get bigger as we go forward. We are at the same time all still crushed by the violence of the US-Israeli project of putting our siblings in Gaza into concentration camps and by the urgency of our resistance. So even as we have this gathering that feels hopeful and helpful, it's always important to acknowledge how hard it is to do that all the time. We are super lucky to have this talk today by three thinkers whose work has been so formative in many of our thinking and understanding of Zionism, race, gender, bodies, and minds. And this is part of a larger project that we are trying to build really from this work on smear and hate mail as technologies of Zionist power. We've had some other sessions on smear, which I encourage you to check out on our YouTube channel or on our website, which is criticalzionismstudies.org. And we will have more talks. We have actually an upcoming talk on smear as counterinsurgency that's being organized by Dylan Rodriguez, and we have more coming up. Our folks, like many of you, probably most of you, have been the recipients of a flow of hate mail, Zionist hate mail, that is at once kind of individual and kind of like stochastic, and at the same time organized and really deliberate. The messages are very different from public Zionist messaging. The idea for this panel then is to take those messages seriously, to take out what's in private, what's sent in the dark, and make it the subject of our study, to think about what it's trying to do and what we learn from those hate mails about Zionism as ideology, culture, power structure, and project. So Lisa Duggan is moderating, and she will introduce Jasbir, Puar, and Lara Sheehi, and thank you all three so much for doing this work. I want to introduce Lisa first. She's been an incredible mentor to me personally and a supporter and advisory board member for the Institute. Lisa is a journalist, activist, and a professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU. Some of her books, not all of them, are The Twilight of Equality, Neoliberalism, Cultural Politics, and the Attack on Democracy, Mean Girl, Ayn Rand, and Neoliberal Greed. And she's currently finishing a book on Steve Bannon and the rise of American fascism. But she's also a queer icon whose writing on capitalism, neoliberalism, and the ways they work through culture has shaped at least two generations of scholars and activists. And she was the American Studies Association president who led the historic boycott resolution a decade ago that made ASA a space where the critical study of Zionism has been regularly undertaken as part of the fabric of Indigenous and settler colonial studies and the study of empire, race, gender, capital, and really everything else. So thank you, Lisa, for all of that and for moderating this discussion. And I'll hand it over to you with just a note that folks can post questions in the chat throughout, and we'll try and pull them out during the Q&A. So Lisa, to you.
Thank you so much, Amaya, and thank you for founding and directing the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. You know, one of the things we desperately need are institutions and sites where we can work outside of the university because of all of the repression within the university. It's more important than ever that we build institutions where our work and our conversations can take place without the kind of repression that's going on at the university. So thank you, Amaya, for the amazing amount of work you've done building that, the Institute and organizing conversations and distributing scholarship. Thank you so much for that. Today, I think it's really particularly exciting and interesting to have basically three different eras of very intensive Zionist hate mail production represented on this panel. So I am the elder, who received the avalanche of Zionist hate mail. I mean, I continue to receive it, but I received my avalanche of it in 2014 after the American Studies Association passed the boycott resolution. Whereas Jasbir received her avalanche of hate mail after the publication of her really extremely important book, The Right to Maim, which came out in 2017. So Jasbir has received hate mail before and after then, but that was the massive avalanche came with the publication of that book. Whereas Lara has received the avalanche of hate mail post October 7th, right after the new sort of escalation and organization and institutionalization of repression, especially among people teaching in the university system. So post 2013, Lara has been 2023, Lara has been the recipient of the avalanche. So we have three sort of eras that allow us not only to look at the hate mail and its content and its work, the kind of cultural and psychological and political work that it does, but also to see how it has changed through the use of different technologies at different moments during the past 10 years. And, you know, one of the really important aspects of it that we're going to talk about today is the way the content of it is organized, both around accusing everyone of anti-Semitism, of course, and of being Jew haters and so forth. But in addition, the hate mail is also very much targeted around race, gender, sexuality, citizenship, in a way that the public discourse is less explicit about. But the hate mail, which is intended to be in some sense private, and yet, as Amaya said, is also it's an organized form of attack. It's much more explicit in terms of the racial, gender, sexuality forms of insult. And we want to talk about that, about the settler colonial project and about the use of race, gender, and sexuality through that, and look at how Zionist hate mail, designed to be in some sense private, is in fact not private at all, not individual or private at all. So I just, as a beginning example, I wanted to read one of my favorite pieces of hate mail. The American Studies Association published a website, which I thought had been taken down, but it turns out it's still up, bdsloveletters.com. So you can find bdsloveletters.com, where we posted our hate mail. It's a very interesting read. When you see it all collectively, you can both analyze it and also realize how inadvertently hilarious it often is. So I'm going to read, Amaya, can you screen share the post and I'll read it, and then I'll introduce our panelists. From Caesar God, at least that's the name that was the email alias. Congratulations on your election to the presidency of the American Study Association. It is groups like the ASA who are exemplars in the proactive support of Islamo terrorists, suicide bombers, killers of Jewish babies, and unarmed civilians. Your promotion and adherence to deviance from sexual norms makes your election especially noteworthy. We know how warmly the Islamos embrace dykes, homos, switch hitters, gender confused, and all the other non-heteros. There's a PS. I hear that your name is being circulated regarding a future Nobel in hemorrhoid bonding, another worthy academic pursuit to advance humankind. Okay, so you can take that down. Hemorrhoid bonding, that was really a new one on me. But you can see it starts out with the usual, you know, Jew hater, suicide bomber supporter, and then it goes on to address me specifically as an openly queer person. And the contradiction that is really runs through all of that anti-queer hate mail is this contradiction of saying, don't you realize the Islamos hate perverts and dykes like you? So it's really, you know, a weird contradiction. Oh, it's the Islamos who hate perverts and dykes like me, is it? So anyway, I want to introduce our panelists who have a lot to share about their own analyses and understanding of hate mail. And I'm going to begin by introducing Jasbir Puar, who is Distinguished Faculty of Arts Professor in the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia. And I really love this title. She is the extraordinary professor in Women's and Gender Studies Department at the University of Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. She is the author of award-winning books, The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability, which came out in 2017, and which has been translated into Spanish and is forthcoming in Portuguese, and also of Terrorist Assemblages, Homo Nationalism in Queer Times, which came out in 2007, and is available in French, Spanish, and Portuguese, and reissued also as an expanded version for its 10th anniversary in 2017. Her articles have been published in journals such as Social Text and South Atlantic Quarterly, mainstream venues such as Al Jazeera and The Guardian, and translated into more than 15 languages. Dr. Puar is also co-author of exhibitions for the Sharjah, am I saying that correctly? Pronouncing that correctly, the Sharjah Architectural
It's Sharjah. Sharjah.
Sharjah. Okay, and the Sharjah Art Biennial in 2023. In 2019, she received the Kessler Award from the Center for Gay and Lesbian Studies at CUNY, which recognizes lifetime achievement in and impact on queer research and organizing. Our second speaker is going to be Lara Sheehi, who is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar, and is coming to us from Doha right now, and a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. She's the founding faculty director of Psychoanalysis and Arab World Lab. Her work is committed to decolonial and feminist methodologies, and she's especially interested in psychoanalysis, the psychic refusal central to liberation struggles and life-making in the global South, the psychic dimensions of resistance and revolution, and critical Zionist studies. She is co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, a book you should all be familiar with, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which came out in 2022 and won the Middle East Monitor's Palestine Book Award for Best Academic Book. Lara is the immediate past president of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology and co-editor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality. She's a member of the founding collective for the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, and currently working on a new book, From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures. So we will open up with just general opening statements from Jasbir and Lara, and then we'll follow with question and answer and discussion format. You all are free to add your questions to the chat, and Amaya will review them, and we will try to answer some of your questions as well. So we're going to begin with Jasbir.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for your introduction. Maya, thank you for gathering us. It's really nice to be here with all of you. Lisa, thanks for that introductory example. I think one of the things that I hope we get to talk about is kind of resistance strategies and collective resistance strategies. And one of those strategies, frankly, for me, has been to embrace levity and the kind of ridiculousness of these messages at every opportunity, not to minimize or to normalize any of these forms of violent rhetoric, but to give us political courage collectively. So thank you for sharing that. I want to say that it's really meaningful for me to be in conversation with Lisa and Lara, because I've been in the thick of it with both of them in really intense and meaningful ways. The boycott resolution was actually passed in 2013. So now we're coming up on 12 years with the American Studies Association. And Lisa and I have been defendants in a lawsuit against the American Studies Association because of that boycott resolution passage. It's in its 10th year now. So we have been, Lisa and I and the other defendants have been—
Haven't won anything.
Yes, we're still
They haven't won
waiting.
anything.
We're
10
still
years and they
waiting.
haven't won anything.
They haven't won anything, and we have been in so many meetings, kind of working through strategy, and so much of that strategy around public defamation and the kind of smear campaigns and hate mail have changed over time. So it'll be interesting to talk about that. But just that Lisa is my comrade of many things, including in this lawsuit that we will win. And then Lara, I met because she reached out when her own intensification of smear campaigning started for her at George Washington University. And so I got an opportunity to really learn from Lara because she didn't shy away. I think for a long time, a lot of the conventional wisdom was don't respond, don't engage, don't feed these attacks, don't address anyone, let the media cycle run its course, ignore. And Lara was like, no. Lara was like, I am responding. I am going to address these MFs. I am going to say my piece. I am going to interview. I am going to write. And and to me, it signaled a really important moment of challenging a kind of conventional wisdom of how we had been handling these things, and taking it to the next level, taking it to the offensive as opposed to the defensive, or the kind of retracted space that we had been dealing with for a while, that we had been kind of advocating for a while, or advising for a while. In order to get ready for this event, I had to kind of pause and reflect on actually the multiple smear campaigns that I faced over the past 15 years. So starting in 2010, since I first supported and signed on to BDS and started speaking publicly about Palestine. And aside from one piece in Jadalia that I wrote in response to a set of harassment that happened in 2016, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Aside from that one piece in Jadalia, which I can put into the chat, I've never discussed this. So I'm really grateful for this space. I think it's a really smart project to think, kind of textually and politically about what's happening through hate mail. These conversations matter, and they surface what many of us have been forced to endure in silence. I also share whatever I shared today, knowing that every Palestinian friend, every Palestinian colleague and comrade that I love or that I'm in the world with has faced so much worse. And for many, this harassment often disappears into the condition of simply being Palestinian. So it's so constant, it goes often unspoken. And so in some sense, I think it's, for me anyway, it's important not to exceptionalize these experiences, but at the same time, also refuse to normalize them. So that's the kind of balance that I'm always trying to think about when I talk about this stuff or not talk about this stuff. I want to say that, of course, hate mail never arrives in isolation. If you're getting hate mail, there's already a bunch of things that has already started happening. It's always the visible tip of a broader smear campaign. Its presence typically signals a cascade already in motion of doxing, right-wing media coverage. There can be FOIA requests. There's possibly been classroom surveillance and circulation of footage. And there's, the spread of misinformation across social media, the accusation of anti-Semitism. For me, I don't experience hate mail as part of a public-private divide. So the vitriol that I've received in emails has always either followed with or even echoed what had already been stated on public platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And sometimes those public platforms, the messaging on those platforms, which was actually much worse than what I received directly to me. And so in that sense, I don't think of hate mail as private speech or even speech that is licensed through the facade of privacy. I think it's part of a kind of coordinated continuum of harassment. And smear campaigns, hate mail, they don't just coexist, they operate in concert, and they're kind of reinforcing each other across media and institutional landscapes. What do we call this This is information warfare strategy. This is ideological warfare. This is counterinsurgency. This is asymmetrical warfare. This is attritional warfare. Whatever we call it, we have to name it. This is warfare, right? And I think it's important, again, not to normalize it, but not to exceptionalize it either, which for me which means for me that we move quickly from shock to analysis. We can be shocked by the vitriol and the viciousness expressed in hate mail, but we shouldn't be surprised. This is one of those I'm shocked but not surprised situations, right? Because, you know, these people are co-signing a genocide after all, right? And so we can assemble these archives of hate mail and doxing language to analyze, to counter individual isolation, which I think is really important, to recognize patterns of speech, recurring themes, language and phrase repetition, the use of metaphors, and so forth. So I took a look at my own archive, which again exists from 2010, and which has had, as Lisa mentioned, specific peak moments, but really has never abated. Continue to get hate mail as just a kind of stream of stuff that I expect to receive. My archive begins in 2010. A few notable trends. There's what Lisa already mentioned, this kind of dehumanizing language in hate mail that often mirrors the dehumanizing rhetorics deployed against Palestinians. So the tropes of animality, being uncivilized, barbaric, violent, backwards. The language functions to racialize dissent, of course. There's a lot of reference to mental instability, mental illness, irrationality, lunacy. And this discourse also played out publicly. So the New York Daily News published an op-ed piece on me, calling me a raving crackpot. The German national press published an interview where a German feminist said that I had lost my marbles. Sie hat nichts alles da. If you know German, that means like your head is empty. The playbook for gender studies scholars is especially specific. It's a combination of anger from the far right who want to dismantle DEI, and they see gender studies as an illegitimate or frivolous discipline. And then on top of that, gender studies is this kind of central location in the university for anti-Zionist thinking and activism. And then you have the kind of righteous outrage of the liberals who profess to be properly aligned with feminist and queer ideals. And so the ideological force of pinkwashing is really significant here in the kind of hate mail rhetoric. And so what appears to be what Lisa was describing too is a kind of irony, liberals deploying sexist and homophobic language to attack feminist and queer scholars who express solidarity with Palestine. It's not actually ironic at all. It kind of reveals how easily liberal commitments to gender and sexuality collapse when confronted with any kind of anti-colonial critique. And so these are not, again, contradictions. They expose the racist underpinnings of a politics that treats feminism and queerness as conditional and as tethered to the presence of empire, the stability of empire. There's somebody who has not muted themselves, and I'm wondering if everyone can just check to make sure they're muted, because there's feed coming back. Great. I want to just mention a few other things. Affect is really key to how hate mail and smear campaigns work to elicit, of course, fear, terror, shame, regret, paranoia, exhaustion, the extraction of emotional labor. This is a kind of affective control and the modulating of affect that's central to Zionist informal violence, in part because the toll is incalculable. The toll is diffuse, it's inarticulable, it's concretely materialized predominantly through things like losing one's livelihood, facing state carceral systems, but the emotional toll is largely invisible. And none of this is, and all of this escapes any kind of legal consequence, right? And so in this regard, one of the most insidious aspects of smear campaigns that I think we don't talk enough about, is that they attempt to rob us of our capacity, not just of speech and speaking openly, but our capacity to think freely, to think complexly. Not just the deterrence of free speech, but more insidiously and harder to recognize, what's happening is the internalization of prescriptions on speech, such that it becomes about the deterrence of thought itself. And so in my own work, I think of theorizing as a kind of reaching for a new lexicon and conceptual apparatuses. And then on the other end of knowledge production, there's no amount of empirical evidence that allows for consensus on this term genocide. So you can see how quickly the process of thinking gets disciplined. And when you add to that the logistics of the micromanagement of events, of speaking conditions, of live feeds, of Zionist harassment at events, of potential protests and cancellations, it's exhausting, and it's nearly impossible not to unconsciously modulate not only speech, but also the way in which we think, how we are allowed to think. And I can talk about this later, but I had an incredibly, I spent 3 months as this extraordinary professor. By the way, extraordinary is just the term that is given to all professors in South Africa who have a visiting appointment. So I am amongst many extraordinary professors. But I spent 3 months at the University of the Western Cape, where there are no prescriptions on thought or speech around Palestine. And there's a kind of, in fact, a constant encouragement to speak as openly as possible. And I had to kind of face that even for those of us who speak out as much as we can in the context of the global North and North America, that there are still ways in which that I had internalized forms of censorship and prescription around speech. And so there was this process of recognizing the extent to which, even when we are politically conscious and doing our best not to shut down around these things, that invariably are on, and Lara, you might be able to speak to this more, invariably our unconscious protective mechanisms kick in to some extent or another, because we have to also survive the situation. I had some notes on how to collectivize our response, but I'm going to bracket those because I hope we can talk about really important ways to not only manage the situation, but also to fight back collectively. I hope we can talk about that later. So I'll pass this on to Lara now.
Thank you. I wasn't allowed. You were just talking about censorship, Jasbir. This is how the way the unconscious works. I wasn't allowed to speak without permission. Hi, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. And I just want to thank Ameya, of course, and my comrades at the Institute, and Yulia, too, who make this happen. And I just want to put a plug in right up top. This is what it means to create spaces of knowledge production that run counter. This is what Lisa was saying, is that we need spaces that sort of do this work. And I really would like for you all to consider, when you're considering where to donate, what to support, that the Institute is one of the places you think about. And I think this kind of conversation is precisely what we're hoping to be able to do. I'm so touched to be in conversation with Jasbir, definitely, and Lisa as well. They're folks who I've looked up to for a very long time, but there's a special place in my heart for Jasbir because of what you kicked off by saying this, Jasbir, that we got connected around this. And yes, I did say, I'm not going to stop, but I did say motherfucker. And this is, and I said the exact word, but this is part of it. And I'm saying this right now because part of the sort of carceral system, and definitely comes down really hard in a very gendered way. There was a massive sort of like, one of the talking points around this was how much I use the word fuck. And there was an entire like 15,000 word article called Lara Sheehi's Joyous Rage that was written by a morbidly obsessed academic that I'm not going to name because he's just made his career off of bullying people. And that was the whole point, right? Is to say that not only is this person, you know, pro-Palestine, but there's crassness that's involved, and there's already a sort of invitation into, of course, there's no credibility. Nobody who has any credibility or thinks clearly or should be listened to is somebody who would use the word fuck or motherfucker or whatever else that I use, but I'm intent on using those words because sometimes they're needed and they are quite emphatic. But one of the things also that just came up already from what Lisa and Jasbir have been saying is that part of the psychic warfare, and I do spend a lot of time thinking about the psychic warfare that's involved and psychic intrusions, and smear being one of those things. I wrote a piece about how smear campaigns are part of settler colonial sort of outposts, and they're about extending settler sovereignty. And one of the things that I'm thinking about, if we're thinking about Zionism, the expansionism of Zionism, one of the things that I think about also is the expansionism into the psychic sphere. And that is part of the psychic warfare. But let me sort of mark something right away, is right away we're in the category now. If you think about everything that has been told to us post Al-Aqsa flood, Tawfan Al-Aqsa, right, is that the point is the contouring of the narrative is meant to reset the time frame, is for us to think and be pulled into constantly arguing against the time frame that starts in October 2023, right? And that repetition of that, now many of us who've been part of the fight understand that nothing started in October 2023, but the way that we recalibrate and sort of mark things there is part of the psychic warfare, right? So, but you've already heard from folks that say this stuff has been going on for decades. And we know that, of course, from our Palestinian siblings who, like Jasbir said, have had to prove this condition over and over and over and over and over again for decades, for 77, you know, years tomorrow, by the way, in terms of the beginning of the Nakba. So I'm saying that because certainly there's been an uptick, I think, for all of us post Al-Aqsa floods. The smear campaign that started off for me was in January 2023 when Stand With Us filed the Title VI complaint against my former employer and redacted everybody's name except mine. And that was the start of everything. There is this, you know, piece of this where, yes, Jasbir was somebody that was there immediately. And I just want to kind of really publicly, you've not talked about your smear campaign, Jasbir, and this is something I have not talked about publicly either, is the tenderness and the love and generosity, and I am getting emotional because this is part of it, that I was met with, is part of what's sustaining in the face of all of this. And so she was really the first person who spoke to me about and walked me through what it would look like and the ways in which gender and race would be mobilized at a rate and at a power that you needed to sort of have that analytic with you so that you didn't feel like the world was sort of falling, that you were going to be swallowed up by all of this. And that invitation to clarity is what allowed me to say, I understand what is happening here. I understand the logic that's happening as an Arab woman, understanding that what was being asked, what was being actually said to me and was being said several times over listservs, of course, professional listservs as well, not just the sort of the hate mail, was very much from randos. And Emeya, you can show some of those randos that were writing me. And certainly when Fox News picked it up, when the New York Post picks it up, you get an uptick of these, which is an interesting thing as well. But for me, there was also an inside my own profession, also people sort of attacking me. And the logic that was being used was disappear the Arab as a fix for anti-Semitism. And Jasbir's invitation for me to understand analytics, that this followed a trend, followed a pattern, her invitation to keep the ability to think, was precisely what walked me through to the militancy, the psychic militancy that I needed, and the recognition that actually the Arab needed to keep speaking. that the disappearance of the Arab was a complete misguided process, that even if I stopped speaking, that this would fix nothing, that the admission of guilt would happen anyway, that this was an entire setup. And part of speaking back to that was to say and to acknowledge that the contouring of these narratives happen along fault lines that already exist. And that's part of what Lisa and Jasbir have already walked us through, right? That the coming together of misogyny, of racism, and really anti-communism and jingoism all at once meant that there was this infrastructure that was already there, and it was ready to be animated at any point. Now, of course, when it finds its target, the ways in which it's channeled and animated became very specific. So mine, of course, had to do with my Arabness. There was an assumption that I was Palestinian because, of course, there's no, obviously, anybody who talks about Palestine must be Palestinian. There's no like that. And that actually collapse is really important as well. So the other thing that was helpful to be in conversation with somebody like Jasbir is really calling into real praxis what it means when we say that if structures of oppression work in this way and they are meant to overwhelm you, this comes on every platform. Like Jasbir was saying, it is not just a one-off. It is meant to make you feel like you are drowning in this sort of force of power. That there's also a way in which us insisting that we create ways and methods that are locked up and locked in arms as a counterforce to this is just as important. And so being in that conversation with Jasbir, even though it was not public knowledge, was a way in which she and I were in conversation around this and really staying grounded in the shared experience that we were having, in the logic of why this happens, in our own targeting, in the ways in which women of color, of course, also get targeted at a higher rate. And that is not a secret, that was being made, in the ways that language was being used, in the swiftness of this. That was also a way in which we were sort of demonstrating, what does it mean when we say we take care of each other? Our schools, our universities were not the ones that were taking care of us. That was clear from the beginning. It was sort of like, how do we maintain and sustain a network of care and solidarity that goes beyond the confines of the university and any sort of formal processes? We did that too. It was sort of like, we need to do these formal processes for these reasons. And also, this is actually the space where we come together and we talk about the ways in which this is happening. And there's an intellectual exercise there, but there's also an affective exercise and one of comradeship, and one that we are coming together around a shared cause. And we were talking about it, and we understand that these campaigns are not individualized. They might play through an individual, right? January 2023 was way before. Now there are countless people who are going through this, or the doxing. There's a doxing truck in April that actually had my face and my partner's face on it in New York, and then 2 weeks later in DC, and then in December again in DC. Before this was like every day there's a doxing truck. So there was something about us saying and coming together and recognizing this may be individualized in as much as you are the target right now, but this follows a logic that actually is constitutive to the violence of Zionism, and the ways in which, if we think about Zionism as a structure and a sort of ideology that's based around domination, extraction, and exploitation, then why wouldn't people who are working in the movement against this also become part of that? And how do we maintain the ability to see us, yes, as individual targets to protect ourselves, but then also as sort of representational symbols of a larger movement, and why Zionism has to come down so hard on that, right? There's something really important about this too. If you see some of the emails that were sent, or Amaya sort of put it up, is that they're doing the connections for us. Sometimes as we're thinking through these things, we are like, what's the connection between, you know, trans issues and Palestine and all that? And fascists know this. and they come together immediately and they're like, this is how this is all connected. If you're for Palestine, you're against the United States. If you're for Palestine, you must be a trans lover. If you're for, and all those things are like, yeah, okay, yeah, that's true. It's like, because I'm against imperialism and any sort of oppressive force that's going to stabilize hegemonic modes of being. But I think it's really important for us to think about how fascists really understand these links, and there actually are no contradictions there. It's an important reminder for us. So when this hate mail started to come, not only was it helpful to think about the ways in which they were falling on already sort of fault lines, but also to think about the links that were already there, where gender, race, and Palestine come together as destabilizing forces to the coherence of white supremacy or settler colonialism or cis heteronormativity. And that's why that is what was being named. So you have these emails that come together, you know, there's one that says you're literally Rachel Dalzell, right? And then start to say, oh, are you even a woman? And these conversations. And if we read it at surface value, you're like, what is this person even talking about? But if we start to take a step back and think about what are the structures or the ideological formations that actually destabilize, you know, these modes of hegemonic power, then that connection is actually a really easy one in the mind of somebody who's a racist ideologue, right? And Zionism becomes the way in which that is mobilized. There's a lot more I could say, but I'm excited about the Q&A and being in conversation. So I'm going to stop there. And thank you again.
Thank you so much. That's just incredibly useful and provocative from both of you. There are two questions that were raised by you and by Amaya that I want to make sure we cover. We don't have a lot of time, so there are two questions that seem really significant and I want to make sure we cover them. So the first one has to do with change over time, right? And also the technological and ideological change over time. Because in 1914, there really was something more of a public-private divide, and that what was said on social media was not the same as what was coming through on my email. But that changed by 2016, right? There started to be an absolute convergence of it. And it's not only the technology change, but also the ideological structures of that technology change. Social media became more and more white, a voice box for the right wing, for the far right. And so there was that shift, which was also reflected like in the fact that in 2014, when I received death threats, NYU posted guards at my door and also posted guards at the conference that I organized on Israel, Palestine. But this year I was made persona non grata on this campus for having been a faculty observer at a student pro-Palestine contest. So I was barred from all university buildings for being an observer at a protest. So the ideological change and the technological change over time, I think, is one thing I would like you all to say something about. And then the other thing was the really important thing Jasbir raised at the end, which is about collectivizing our response. We tried to do that with bdsloveletters.com. It was an attempt to put all the email out there for everybody could see all of it, and also to allow us to laugh at it as well as analyze it. So, so how do we think about collective responses to our to this phenomenon and the way it's connected in all of these other ways to all the smear campaigns and the boycotts and how do we think about that in relation to resistance against Palestinian erasure? How do we think about ourselves in relation to the survival of Palestine and the response to this email? So question number one is change over time, and then we'll come back and talk about collective responses. I hope we can cover that before we run out of time. And then Amaya, you can check the chat and see what we have in terms of questions. So change over time. Jasbir?
Yeah, when I look at the hate mail from 15 years ago, they almost seem kind of quaint. It's a kind of like grassroots community backlash. There's like this outraged, conserved, like civic-minded individual, you know, who's just absolutely confused and befuddled as to how I could, you know, be saying certain things or aligned with certain things. And so there is a kind of, you know, you imagine that you were having this interaction with an individual. And I think there's such a big change now from that to the development of all this technological infrastructure and platforms that sustain and automate. There's, you know, a confluence of tech companies with the government and with institutions, right? With these think tanks, with these legal watchdog organizations. I think of it kind of as like we've gone from, you know, hate mail as letters to hate mail as like a logic, like an algorithmic logic in some sense. So you have less this concerned individual. There's still, of course, there's still of course, the facade of an individual engaging with you. But these are all kind of platformed, organized through platformed technologies, scraping, coordination, distribution, circulation, amplification, repetition. And all of this stuff is, if it's not platform assisted, which it often is, it's always platform permitted, right? And so you have this organic outrage masquerading as what it really is militarized control. It is the kind of a deeply interconnected surveillance structure. It's coordinated with the resources of think tanks, of campus monitors, Campus Watch, PR firms, online vigilantes are still in the mix there. And so I think increasingly this kind of informal Zionist violence is embedded in the logics of code and of coding. It's embedded in the policies that refuse to counter misinformation. So for example, like Meta's like, we're not going to correct misinformation anymore. It refuses to remove Islamophobic hate speech while also censoring pro-Palestine content. And so you have these platforms acting as extensions of the Zionist state. And then there's also the last part I'll mention about this, which I think is really important, is about the profit models of these tech companies, right? Hate mail, doxing, trolling, all of this stuff is both economically incentivized as well as subsidized. Clickbait is important. What is excitable to the platform? What is rewarded is what elicits algorithmic traction and speed. And it's very important. The speed of the onslaught has definitely increased. Yeah. When I was engaging with Lara, it was so intense what was happening, and it was happening so fast. And I recognized that is part of the technological apparatuses of these platforms, that they have figured out how to do this. And the Zionist campaigns solicit these features of platforms. They provoke visibility, outrage, controversy, exposure. And in this way, smear campaigns can become nearly self-sustaining in terms of short-term but high-impact momentum. The production of scale and scalability is central. And the attacks are more, I would say, transnational than ever because of all of this interface. And then there's one last thing I wanted to mention about this, which actually takes me back to work that I had actually done on predictive targeting and predictive policing in terrorist assemblages almost 20 years ago now, where we've started seeing more of these forms of predictive targeting through these platforms that are being used to hone in on vulnerable individuals, using AI, using data points, organizational affiliations. So if you're affiliated with US ACB or Samudun, the mapping of solidarity networks, GIS info from protests, from your kind of where your location, where you've been. So it's not just individuals being targeted, but what I called way back when in terrorist assemblages, a data body. A composite of information. It's not always wedded to what someone has said or done in specific, but rather it becomes this assemblage of statistics and data points that render a profile suspect, right? And this is precisely what they do with like broken windows, criminal predictive targeting kinds of algorithmic, predictive technologies. So I'll stop there.
Oh. One of the interesting things about this, Jasbir, as you're talking about, is that, and this is an important piece for us to look at, is that all of these organizations, like you're saying, work in tandem. And I was able to track it almost down to the, like, one day Stand With Us would say something, then it would be, Canary Mission that would pick it up and try to generate clicks on it, then stopantisemitism.org. But the investment in looking like it's a grassroots effort is one of the primary ways in which they work. There's a way in which these organizations want folks to identify with this one poor little person behind there just trying to do the right thing, and this is how it's being disseminated, but really it's an entire infrastructure. Maya has a wonderful piece about astroturfing organizations, and so Maya, if you would plug that, that's amazing, because this is part of what they do, is this sort of generate an entire online economy and sort of system that, like Jasbir was saying, becomes self-generating. I mean, there's the settler state has an entire project called Project Butterfly, which is meant to actually intervene on campuses in the context of the United States. And a major part of Project Butterfly are these bot farms that actually have bots that comment under everything, that if you were sort of track it and even have followers, they're unrecognizable in terms of whether they're real people or not. And that is, I think, how the terrain has entirely changed. Now, one thing I will say is what's fascinating is that in the midst of all of that, I still got snail mail, hate mail. Like, that's commitment. Right? And like cut up like sociopath, like in movies. One of which was like the return address was "Your Dead Meat," and it was Rashida Tlaib's return address. So you can see the ways in which people are both using these platforms, but these platforms end up being more organizational and sort of meant to do an ideological thing and actually further that ideological discourse. It's also disseminating discourse. And that's one of the things that I think is not just, yes, astroturfing, overwhelming somebody, making sure, I know Stephen's saying the memories that are involved, is making sure that there's a discourse that is ready to be mobilized, because people who are consuming this now also have a discourse that they're using. They're repeating the sort of Zionist propaganda. They're repeating Hasbara lines. They're repeating the reasons why. One of the things that was shocking, and it's true, Jasbir and I, like, every day would be like, oh my God, this is the new thing. Like, what is happening here? And one of the most important things she said to me very early on was, have other people monitor what's happening online, because of how overwhelming this can be. But one of the things that I think it was Stand With Us that did immediately was start to like advertise how many letters had been sent to the GW administration proudly. And they'd say things like, proudly sent 2,000 letters. And so there's also a way, the spectacle of it, the thing of like, something is being done about this person, go get her. And then the ways in which people are psychically involved in that process of making sure justice is delivered, right? Through, of course, a pre-written email that one would think that administrators are like looking at this and being like, this is the same thing. Recently, this happened to Stephen, and they actually, you'll love this, Jasbir, this was a talk in South Africa. And he said in the transcript, he said, as Fanon teaches us, and they transcribed it as my mom teaches me instead of Fanon. Like, they don't even care about, which for a psychoanalytic person, I'm just like, great, slip here. But the point is, it doesn't matter. The accuracy doesn't matter. It's about overwhelming people and overwhelming administrations, and what administrations end up feeling like they have to do something. It's about exacting that urgency to act. And when there's an urgency to act, there is usually never a well thought out plan in terms of how one acts. And the idea is, if you do not act now, this will be never ending, and we will flood your inboxes, and we will make you have to do the work. In the same ways that being on the receiving end of these hate mail campaigns, and the way that it's changed, is it's a time suck. It takes up so much time, and the point is to demobilize us and take us offline, both in terms of thinking, but also in producing knowledge and counter discourses that to what is being disseminated. by these sort of technologies, but I think this is how the way they all sort of work together. The front of grassroots is important because nobody's going to join a sort of conglomerate, you know, that they're like, oh, we're this sort of like supremacist conglomerate that are out here trying to get people via bots, is not a very sellable a sellable point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to add a little bit about the change over time thing, and that is, you know, back in 2014, there was a hit piece on me in Forbes magazine, and they organized donors to demand that I be fired, right, at NYU. But the NYU administration board of trustees at that time were like libertarian, hard neoliberals, and they basically said, "Fuck off." You know, we're not, you can do anything you want. You can threaten to take your money away. Fuck off. And like Michael Bloomberg style hard neoliberals, right? Remember when he said, if you object to Judith Butler and Omar Barghouti speaking at Brooklyn College, you should go to North Korea, right? It's like this sort of weird moment then, and now it's completely different. And these are actually at the NYU administration level. The board is a bunch of real estate developers and student loan profiteers and MAGA people, but the administration are liberals, right? And they are cracking down harder, much harder, and using the anti-Semitism rationale to give it a patina of some kind of progressiveness. And really, there's facial recognition, you know, cameras everywhere, the entire campus, all the common spaces are blocked off. And the minute they catch you, the punishments are severe and quick. It's very, very, you know, it's a very different moment. And it's just funny, the ideological shift there is you know, dramatic, right? But anyway, I wanted to finalize by talking, before we go to the questions from our chat, to talk about collective, what we do collectively and how we think about a collective resistance to this. Jasbir. Jasbir is muted.
Yes, now I am not. Okay, I think that this was mentioned already by Lara, but to see ourselves as part of this, you know, apparatus and system is so important to de-individualize immediately. So if this starts happening to you immediately, one of the most important goals of smear campaigns and hate mail is to demobilize and to deflate and to isolate and to force you into a space where you're internalizing some kind of anxiety. It's, you know, it's about making one feel fear, terror, but also shame and regret, worry that someone said or did something they shouldn't have. And so all of this has to be resisted immediately and kind of put into the framework of an overarching structure. And I think one of the reasons, Lara, when you first came to me, one of the reasons why I was so attentive to this is because this did not happen for me. When I started getting, when my department started getting phone calls, and this is the other thing too, is that these campaigns don't just target one person, even though they purport to be about one person. Our entire department was destabilized by what was happening. And our students were feeling unsafe. And then we were forced into these modes of securitization. But, you know, I walked into my chair's office and they had been flooded with phone calls and emails all day. And she said, Jasbir, what did you do? And I was like, what do you mean, what did I do? And so immediately we have to make sure that those kinds of responses are just, they're unacceptable. We have to have a kind of abolitionist approach to hate mail and smear campaigns. No one is guilty of doing anything wrong. It is the system, it is a setup. It is made to make people feel like they could have avoided this situation, and I think this is also something that is maybe a little less relevant now than it was before October 7th, because now the scale of targeted campaigns and smear campaigns and hate mail is so much bigger. So, you know, the good news is that it's not so easy to isolate targets in the same way as it was 15 years ago. Being targeted can always turn into an opportunity for strengthening community There's so much supportive community now. I want to plug the Palestinian anti-repression network that I'm a part of, that's doing work to support people who have been targeted and people whose jobs are under review or they've been terminated. I became a kind of go-to person at Rutgers for this kind of support. And so it's really great to see more formal apparatuses and institutions kind of coming into existence right now for this, especially for more vulnerable people, faculty, students, and staff. The more that we can publicly archive of this kind of public discourse, the better. The more that we can analyze, the more information that we have. I do think that if you're in a situation where you have supportive colleagues or people that you work with, that it's good to have discussions preemptively about what can and should happen should someone get targeted. I know that students are being quite proactive about this, going to supportive faculty members and saying, I'm worried that ICE is going to come after me. Can we have a plan in place? Can we have set up a network for faculty accompanying students to help them get groceries, to do daily errands, to figure out what to do with my dissertation if I have to leave the country suddenly, like where is it stored? How can we access things? All of these things, I think, are really important as structures. And then again, I think we have to take some pleasure in all of it that is preposterously humorous, right? We have to grab levity wherever we can. And again, not to minimize how awful this stuff is, but to also kind of note their weaknesses and the points of incoherence and the ineptness of some of this stuff. So there have been many funny things that have happened to me in these various iterations of smear campaigns. You know, there was, there was the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora contacted the president of Princeton University to demand that the right to name be taken off the syllabus of apparently the one lone professor in the United States who's teaching my work. You know, there was a campaign to demand that Duke University Press stop publishing The Right to Name after it came out in 2017. But all the emails and phone calls were going to the deans and provost offices at Duke University because they didn't know the difference between Duke University and Duke University Press. You know, so I was talking to Ken Wissaker and he's like, we haven't heard a word. You know, it's all going to, you know, so these are funny things that start happening, and they also point to us again, you know, the holes in some of this stuff, the inconsistencies in some of this stuff, the ineptitude in some of this stuff. They point to the ways in which, you know, Zionists don't fully understand how the spaces that we operate in work necessarily. So those are some ideas.
One of the other things also that really occurred to me, whether it was from people from within the profession or otherwise, is that there was a misunderstanding about my commitment, my political commitments to the world. And I think that is really important. Like I often say this, that these fascists thought that this was a side gig. And so if something's a side gig, you kind of drop it right away. But when it's a central tenet to your responsibilities to the world, that is what we rally behind as well. And I think remaining clear on like what is the actual goal here. The goal is a liberated Palestine. And when you think about Palestine as the centerpiece for all of our movement, and that is why there's a smear campaign, then it's also a grounding way to cohere around that, no matter what is coming at you, right? That's the both recognizing, yes, I'm an individual target. That is why they redacted everybody's name except mine and said, go after her. But that would not be happening to me if I did not speak and demand for a free Palestine, right? So a reminder about that. And that also kind of reconfigures what our central grounding force should be, that it always should be around Palestine. And I always say that in many ways, there was this like not so invisible line of global comradeship that was sort of drawn by these Zionists, because they do underestimate Jasbir, like Jasbir was saying, what these networks look like and how they they spring into action in really important ways. And that's the other thing that I want to say about collective action. We oftentimes really do a disservice to ourselves when we keep saying things like, we're not organized, we're not that. There might be many things that we need to do, but remember, like, what are the conditions we're organizing around? But the amount of people and organizations and mutual aid that have sprung into action, whether it's from Al-Aqsa flood or beforehand, or those of us who got attacked beforehand, is to remember that none of that can happen if the infrastructure is not there and the organizing is not there to begin with. So I think there's something also really important about us. There's already a way in which these collective actions are being thought through, and what are the ways in which we can mobilize them to spring into action in particular moments and seize those moments and then move it a step further. The other thing that I will say, and this is coming both from a psychological perspective, but also from my experience, is abuse is meant to happen and stay silent, right? And I've said this before, but I can't say it enough times. Abusers want to abuse you and make sure that the conditions are there that you will not talk about that abuse, because that's part of power. Part of power is to make sure that I can do whatever I want and make you feel like this, and you're going to be too scared to say anything, right? So us de-atomizing and sort of talking to each other, and like I was saying, that just this connection with Jasbir, who I had always admired her work but didn't know her personally, and being able to do that immediately, that even being able to articulate those things and say, this shit's not happening without somebody having eyes on it. What I do personally is every time I get something on Instagram or LinkedIn, I post it to my stories, and I don't delete their names or anything like that. One person on LinkedIn, Amaya, do you have that LinkedIn piece? I just want to show that quickly. I posted that on Instagram, and this is the collective action. There's a LinkedIn one, I think. Do you have it? You might not have put it on. Anyway, there was a LinkedIn one that came to me, and it was from a person's like personal LinkedIn right directly to me. And it was something about like, sucking jihadist dick or something like that. And he's like, I hope you choke on a jihadi dick or something like that. And I posted it on Instagram, and folks talk about collective action. They immediately wrote, and we're just like reported her. And then somebody like wrote his partner or something like that, who like ended up writing me an apology. Like, I'm so sorry that I wrote this to you. And I was doing this in a moment of sadness or something like that. And I'm not saying that's the way, but all I'm saying is the more public we make these things, and the more we insist that we're not going to hide the identities of abusers, and also not internalize it. When you externalize things, it's easier also not to internalize it and hold it in yourself. And so it's an actual project to just be like, here's what I got today, let everybody fucking see it. And folks are by and large very appreciative, because knowing what is happening is also really important for our movement, because it can look like these things aren't happening. Like Jasbir said, it's a little harder now to think nothing of this is happening, but it's just important to continue being clear.
So I have a couple of little postscripts, but I wanted to ask Amaya, is it okay? Can we go to 1:30?
Sure.
So yeah. Okay. So I'll just make a couple of postscript comments, and then we'll go to the questions from the chat. And then one is, Lara, I did the same thing. I posted my email, my hate mail with the names attached. In addition to the BS love letters, I put it on social media. I also responded to my hate mailers. I wrote them back, and people thought I was insane to do it, but I really just couldn't just be non-responsive. So we had some very interesting conversations with hate mailers. But I also wanted to underscore something that Jasbir said, because I also think it's very important. There is a kind of scaling of targets, and of course Palestinians are receive the worst of everything by far. And then secondly, it's people of color, and especially women of color. When the lawsuit was filed against ASA, I'm the only white person that they picked as as a target, right? Everyone else who was on the lawsuit was a person of color. And some of those people had nothing to do with the boycott resolution. And all of the white people, and especially Jewish people who had been involved with pushing the boycott resolution, they were not on the lawsuit. The lawsuit was only people of color and me. And then because I was president, but also the Forbes article, it was a hit piece on me, but the other people they named were all people of color. Right. So it's really the scale, there's a definite selection of people of color and especially women of color who get a larger portion of the hate mail and all of the attacks. And I think that's absolutely obvious, but I just wanted to underscore that. And then the last thing I wanted to say was about securitization and the level of it at this point. And that is, I'm teaching at Barnard in the fall, and the Women's and Gender Studies program at Barnard has been an epicenter of the crackdown. They started it and they've been the epicenter. So I'm teaching there in the fall. And I was told, my colleagues are saying, I have to go to a security training before I go there, before I step into a classroom, because the administration has given the government, the personal emails of the faculty, and they all received personal messages asking them if they were Jewish, right? Supposedly in order to follow up on anti-Semitism, but it also means, they have a list of Jews. But I was told that they're also tracking networks, so that even my social dinner plans and everything need to be on Signal, because they're tracing networks of people through their personal phones that the administration is giving the numbers of. That I can expect there to be a plant in every class I teach that will be about filing Title VI, and also that I have a public syllabus that is separate from the syllabus I'm actually using and circulating maybe only 1 week at a time, so that my teaching Jasbir's book will not be on the website, right? It's like the level of security, it seems like it's paranoid, but it's not at all paranoid. Barnard is an epicenter for, Barnard and Columbia are epicenters, but especially women's studies there for this sort of the necessity of incredible levels of securitization around defending against both individual and collective attacks. So anyway, Amaya, questions from the chat.
Can I just say something quickly, Lisa? You said that,
Yes.
gender and women's studies are sort of the epicenter of that. And this is where I want to bring in anti-trans rhetoric as being the closest thing. A lot of the sites that would reproduce these Times of Israel articles that were like hit pieces on me, or this Fox News, were also sites that like took up gender critical theory around like conversion therapy. And there's a synergy across these sites. And I think that's something for us to also pay attention to in terms of a logic that repeats itself. And that's the closest thing that I see to the sort of astroturfing around Palestine is anti-trans rhetoric as well.
I want to pull in one question from Scott Long, but I actually first just want to say a lot of the questions were about resistance and the process of resistance. So I think you've covered them well. And to the extent that there are questions that we're not covering, I want to sort of, first of all, we're going to do more of this. So your questions are actually quite helpful. But second of all, I want to invite people to propose more ways to think about this. This doesn't have to, the Institute is a platform, and we have the capacity for this conversation. So please join us in this study, even if not in this webinar, let us know what you want to do. So here's the question from Scott. Can we talk more about the gender and perhaps especially sexuality discourses, not just the Hamas would kill you tropes, but the constant accusations of perversion? My most active harasser routinely accuses me of incest with my mother, who died in 1980. I can see that they perceive subversions as all connected in an anti-hegemony front, but what are the psychic formations at work here? So I want to push in general. These conversations open up so much sort of discussion of resistance and emotion, and I also want to make sure that we are theorizing this stuff for the nerds among us.
Jasbir, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I first of all, I think the I guess my immediate response, well, again, to kind of reiterate that I think there's a special place in all of this for gender nonconforming, trans folks, feminists. There's a reason why trans people and Palestinians are like the two most hated people in the United States right now, right? So we have to kind of continue to keep analytically figuring out what those connections are and why the challenge to gender binarism becomes alongside with Palestine, the two things that are going to destroy Western civilization as we currently know it, right? And it is really interesting to me that the far right knows this, and that a lot of leftists continue to produce trans, queer, feminist issues as identity politics, as opposed to absolutely central and intrinsic to the fight against fascism. Like there's a lot of organizing that needs to, and education that needs to happen on the left to stop producing issues around gender sexuality as somehow derivative issues in terms of growing authoritarianisms and fascism. They're absolutely central and key to it. The other thing I would say is, in my own experience of these emails, like pinkwashing has really done its job in terms of convincing a kind of body politic that Israel is this place that is protecting gender and sexual rights, not only for itself, but also in relation to the rest of the region, which is full of all of this perversion and bad heterosexuality, perverse homosexual, all of that stuff. So I think there's just a lot of investment in these Islamophobic and Orientalist tropes that keep getting circulated over and over again in these emails as well. And you can also see it, this goes back to way back 20 years ago, some of the early research that I did in the construction of the Muslim terrorist, which was always about these conditions that produce perverse sexualities, right? So even in government doctrines around who is the Muslim terrorist and what is their psychological makeup, there was always a discussion about deviant sexuality as intrinsic to the makeup of the Muslim terrorist. So there's, a whole body of literature that looks at the psychologization of the terrorist body and what that psychology is. And it's always, that conversation always revolves around sexual perversions of many different sorts.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the right wing knows it, right? The right wing makes these connections all the time and does not treat gender and sexuality or race or like CRT and gender studies, and is connected to pro-Israel, connected to nationalism and all the rest of it. They get those connections and they deploy them. And we get them in our historical and scholarly work, like on the history of imperialism, right? When we write about the history of imperialism, we connect the way that sexuality and race and are fundamentally a part of the organization of the way imperialism works, right? It's like it's all in our historical work. But when we do organizing in the present, that what Jasbir was saying, so often there's a sidelining of certain issues to the side. But I did notice that in the encampments, they were not doing that. The encampments were incorporating gender, sexuality, and broad racial politics, connecting police brutality here with militarism in Palestine, connecting anti-trans politics, that the encampments of the were making those connections in the way that, say, our larger left in the United States often resists them and tries to marginalize as identity issues without understanding the centrality of it.
Yeah, the only other thing that I'd add is that there is this sort of psychic piece, and I think you were talking about the psychic formations of this, of sort of making legible the uniquely destructive character, right? And what is it uniquely, if we think to ourselves, what is it uniquely destructive of? What is the social reproduction, of course, and destabilizing, whether it's imperialism or sort of gender binaries, it's a destabilizing force in a way, and that's the logic that we're following. But the other thing that I want to say that's really important is that when it comes to, I think you had said, I believe the name was Scott, so I'm sorry if I misremembered, but I think you said subversions as like counter-hegemonic, any subversion, but this is also a way that Zionist Hasbro works in deflections, because the moment that is mobilized, we are now arguing that point and what have we moved off of. And so I'm also really interested in the process that happens when any of these things, I'm not saying that they're not transphobes or homophobes or queerphobes, they are, right? We just saw, and they're invested in a social reproduction of a particular type of future, who gets a future and who doesn't. We saw this with the gender reveal when they bombed a home in Gaza with a gender reveal. That is our connection, to see the social reproduction of particular modes of being connect under, right, compulsory cis heteronormativity and settler colonialism and imperialism, and of course capitalism that binds them all. So that's something for us to think about. But in that, when people are like, oh my gosh, this is about, or there is a deflective quality to that is actually really important psychically, because now we've moved off of it again. And that's the thing, is for us to recognize how are we being asked to enter into this conversation, and then what does that move us off of is also a really important piece. And it's sort of deployed masterfully. And I think that there are actual what's it called, guidelines and books around how to do this and how to argue Zionist Hasbro points. Like, this is not a conspiracy. There are actual manuals online that you can see that says, if somebody says this, say this, and don't ever, cede the point and always win an argument. I think that has something to do with it. The content is what we're talking about. The process is something else as well.
I'll pose one more quick question. It's actually, I think, a direct message, not in the chat, but maybe we can end with this, the question is really about how we might frame this sort of hate mail phenomenon and our discussion of hate mail in the context of other understandings of other modes of racism. So Sonia D'Angelo writes, should we be naming hate mail or smear campaigns explicitly as a form of violence, thinking of Black feminist contributions, particularly to the concept of misogynoir, to highlight the gendered and racialized dimensions of technologically mediated violence? So we can take this as a question of, like, how do we relate this conversation to broader conversations, and maybe also how do we construct a resistive framing to begin to talk about this in bigger ways?
A small question in the last.
I mean, I guess one thing is just, when we think about these campaigns and hate mail, and we understand them to be, asymmetrical warfare in the service of the continued genocide of Palestinians, the continued settler colonial occupation of Palestine, we also have to understand them as an important function in the maintenance of settler colonialism and its normalization here in North America as well, right? So these campaigns are doing the work of suppression of free thought and speech in the United States more generally. Hate mail and smear campaigns discipline and repress well beyond the question of Palestine. They make everyone think twice about speaking out, criticizing the United States government. So criticism of Israel and criticism of the United States are basically now synonymous. These are transnational settler colonial projects. And so they secure the growth of authoritarianism and fascism in the United States more generally. So that is just one way of saying, this isn't just about Zionism. It's not just about Palestine. It is the ways in which this is securitizing all of our speech, everybody's speech, all of our preemptively securitizing all of our capacities to think and speak and act and organize and mobilize in certain ways. And that bigger problem certainly has connections to all sorts of things and all sorts of other movements and connected movements, intersectional movements that are happening in the United States as well as elsewhere.
I think we can wrap up. I'd love to know, Lara and Lisa, if you have any last words.
Can't beat that. It's a great place to stop.
Yeah, no, thank you all. It's really a pleasure to be in conversation with you and see you from all different places on the planet when I don't get to see you in New York. So it's really wonderful.
Thank you so much.